The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Saskatchewan prairie as the green and yellow bus rolled north on Highway 35. Inside, 29 young men and staff members of the Humboldt Broncos wore the easy confidence of athletes heading to battle. Their playoff game, just 2 hours away in Nepean. Laughter echoed through the cabin as playing cards slapped against makeshift tables, and someone had started the movie Slapshot on a portable DVD player for the 100th time. Outside the windows, the flat expanse of farmland stretched endlessly under an indifferent sky, the kind of landscape these boys knew in their bones, a place where distances were measured in hours, not miles, and every road trip was a journey into the vastness. Nobody noticed the intersection ahead, where Highway 335 crossed their path like a thread pulled taut across the fabric of their ordinary. Friday evening, the semi-truck barreled westward on Highway 335 at nearly 60 miles per hour, its double trailers loaded with peat moss swaying slightly behind the cab. At the wheel sat Yaskarot Singh Sidhu, a 29-year-old driver with only 3 weeks of experience with this Calgary trucking company, his mind perhaps wandering through the concerns that had plagued his day. The tarps that had come loose 50 kilometers back, the unfamiliar routes, the pressure of his first solo runs. 4 warning signs announced the intersection ahead, each one a guardian crying out in silence. And at the crossroads itself stood an oversized stop sign with a blinking red light, impossible to miss in the fading light. A car waited on the far side of Highway 35, its driver watching patiently for the Broncos bus to pass, obeying the ancient ritual of the right-of-way. But Sidhu did not slow, did not stop, did not see what was coming until metal met metal with the force of inevitability. At 5 p.m. on April 6, 2018, the laws of physics wrote their terrible equation across that rural intersection near Armley, Saskatchewan. The collision happened with such violence that the bus drove into the side of the lead trailer, the impact tearing through the vehicle like a blade through paper, transforming a vessel of dreams into a tomb of twisted steel and shattered glass. The sound carried across the empty prairie a roar that seemed to shake the very earth, and then came silence, broken only by wind moving through wheat fields and the groaning of survivors trapped in wreckage. In those first moments after impact, before the sirens and the helicopters and the world's attention descended upon this forgotten crossroads, there was only darkness and pain and the realization that nothing would ever be the same. 16 people lay dead or dying among the ruins, and 13 others clung to life with injuries that would mark them forever. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The story of the Humboldt Broncos began not in tragedy but in the ordinary magic of small-town hockey, where boys became men on ice rinks and in billet homes scattered across the Saskatchewan prairie. Humboldt was a community of just 6,000 souls, a place where everyone knew everyone, where the Broncos weren't just a junior hockey team but the beating heart of the town's identity and pride. These young men, aged 16 to 21, came from across Western Canada with dreams stitched into their jerseys, dreams of university scholarships, professional contracts, or simply the glory of one more season playing the game they loved. They lived with local families who opened their homes and hearts, creating bonds that went deeper than hockey. And they gave back to their adopted town by shoveling snow for the elderly, organizing floor hockey tournaments for people with disabilities, and walking shelter dogs every week. On Friday afternoons, you could find them stocking shelves at the local grocery store or serving pizza at Boston Pizza. Regular kids doing regular jobs between practices and games. Darcy Hogan stood at the center of this constellation of young lives, a head coach and general manager whose faith was as much a part of him as his love for hockey. He had come to Humboldt from Peace River, where he'd built a reputation not just for wins and losses but for the way he shaped young men's character alongside their slapshots and defensive positioning. His wife Christina and their 2 sons, Carson and Jackson, had built a life in Humboldt, a life woven into the fabric of the community. Through church services at their local congregation and Friday nights at the Elgar Peterson Arena, Darcy never held a grudge, never raised his voice in anger, and when he spoke about hockey, he spoke about it as a vehicle for teaching resilience, teamwork, and grace under pressure. His players knew he cared about them as human beings first, athletes second, and they carried that knowledge with them like a talisman. Among those players was Caleb Dahlgren, the assistant captain who had already learned lessons about faith and perseverance long before he pulled on a Broncos jersey. Since childhood, he'd managed type 1 diabetes, turning his struggle into strength and founding Dahlgren's Diabetes, a program supporting other children facing the same daily battles with blood sugar and insulin. His parents, Mark and Leanne, had raised him in a home where faith wasn't just Sunday morning ritual, but a living practice that shaped how they moved through the world, and Caleb carried that faith onto the ice with him. Logan Boulette, 21 years old, from Lethbridge, Alberta, wore number 6, and played with the kind of selfless determination that made him beloved in the locker room. The summer before, he had told his father Toby that he wanted to be an organ donor. A casual conversation that would later echo across a nation. Evan Thomas at 18, Jackson Joseph at 20, Adam Harold, just shy of his 17th birthday, each carried his own dreams, his own story, his own family's prayers. The team chaplain, Sean Brandow, pastor of Humboldt Bible Church, had woven himself into the Broncos' daily life with a quiet presence that never preached but always listened. He understood that teenage hockey players didn't need sermons about salvation as much as they needed someone who would show up, who would pray with them before games and laugh with them after victories and sit with them in silence when words failed. His connection with Coach Hogan ran deep, rooted in their shared commitment to faith and family. A bond between two men who believed that hockey could be a ministry if approached with the right heart. The season had been building toward this playoff run, the team fighting through the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League bracket, with a kind of determination that made crowds roar and parents drive hundreds of miles through April snowstorms to watch their sons play. On April 6th, they were headed to face the Nipawin Hawks in Game 5 of their second-round series, trailing 3-1 but refusing to surrender. The Broncos' culture was extraordinary in its ordinariness. They were just another team, covering excessive numbers of kilometers across the flat prairies to different cities and towns. Their bus, a second home filled with card games and inside jokes and the particular camaraderie that comes from shared purpose. They had veterans and rookies, affiliate players and full-time roster members, a play-by-play announcer named Tyler Bieber, and a statistician named Brody Hines, who was being mentored in the art of broadcasting. Glenn Dorkson, the bus driver, knew these roads like the lines on his own palm. And Dana Bronze, the athletic therapist, moved through the team with professional competence and maternal care. 29 people aboard one bus, 29 different stories that intersected that Friday afternoon, in the simple act of traveling together toward a hockey game that would never be played. The news reached Humboldt in fragments and rumors before it crystallized into nightmare. Cell phones lighting up across the small town with messages that couldn't be true, wouldn't be true, must somehow be a terrible mistake. Christina Hogan was driving with her sons to Darcy's parents' place when the phone call came. The kind of call that divides life into before and after. The voice on the other end delivering words that seemed to belong to some other family story. She and the boys arrived at Leroy and Laurel Hogan's home and shared the news. And for a long moment, they were simply a family shattered, unable to speak or think or do anything but feel the weight of absence pressing down like a physical thing. Then 12-year-old Carson, wisdom beyond his years, put his arm around his grandfather's shoulders and said he wanted to pray. And in that prayer, offered by a child who had just lost his father, something shifted. Not healing, not yet, but the first glimmer of a path forward through the darkness, across Saskatchewan, and then across Canada, and then across the world. The horror of the Humboldt Broncos bus crash spread like wildfire through social media and news broadcasts, each new detail more heartbreaking than the last. Families rushed to hospitals in Saskatoon and beyond, some to find their sons alive but broken, others to say goodbye to bodies that would never wake, and some to face the terrible uncertainty of not knowing which fate had claimed their child. The community of Humboldt descended into a grief so profound, it seemed to bend reality itself. Neighbors embracing in grocery store aisles, strangers weeping together at gas stations. The normal rhythms of small-town life, suspended in the face of unspeakable loss. Sean Brandau arrived at the crash site not long after the collision, his pastoral training utterly insufficient for what he encountered. Vera. Scene of devastation so complete, it seemed to mock the very idea of divine order. Sounds of groaning and panic and pain that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The chaplain stood amid the wreckage and found himself empty of hope, stripped of the comforting phrases he'd learned in seminary, confronted with a darkness so absolute that his faith felt like a candle flame in a hurricane. He was supposed to have something to offer, some word of consolation or promise that would make sense of this carnage, but standing there among the twisted metal and broken bodies, he had nothing but questions hurled at a silent sky. Where was God in this intersection? Where was divine protection when these boys needed it most? How could a loving Creator allow such random, senseless destruction to fall upon innocent lives filled with promise and potential? The questions had no answers, only echoes that seemed to mock him. And Brandau realized with terrible clarity that he could not fix this, could not explain this, could not do anything but witness it, and somehow survive it. In the hospitals, families kept vigil beside beds where their children fought battles that medicine could barely comprehend, bodies shattered by forces that shouldn't be survivable, minds lost in comas that might never release them. Caleb Dahlgren lay unconscious for 4 days. His parents, Mark and Leanne, sitting beside him in shifts, praying without ceasing, holding on to faith even when it felt like holding on to smoke. When he finally woke, the first thing he learned was the magnitude of what had been lost: 16 of his friends and teammates and coaches gone. His own body broken in ways that would require months of recovery and rehabilitation. Other survivors faced similar reckonings, each one waking to discover that the life they'd lived before April 6th had ended at that intersection, replaced by something new and terrifying and uncertain. Some would never play hockey again, their dreams amended or abandoned, their futures rewritten by forces beyond their control. The families of the dead began the impossible work of planning funerals while the world watched and wept. Each service, a portrait of a life cut short but not diminished. Each eulogy, a testament to love that death could not erase. Parents stood before coffins and spoke words they should never have had to speak, describing sons who would never graduate, never marry, never become the men they were meant to be. The weight of what-ifs pressed down on everyone. If the bus had left 5 minutes later, if traffic had been heavier, if the truck driver had simply stopped, if God had intervened with some miracle that never came. Christina Horgan faced her own grief in the glare of public attention. A widow at 41 with 2 sons who needed their mother to be strong when strength felt impossible. She thought about Darcy, about his faith, about the man he was and the values he'd lived, and she knew that anger and bitterness would dishonor his memory even as they might feel righteous and justified. The criminal justice system moved with its own glacial inevitability, and on January 8, 2019, Yaskirat Singh Sidhu stood before a courtroom in Melfort, Saskatchewan, to hear the impact statements of those whose lives he'd destroyed. He pleaded guilty to 16 counts of dangerous driving causing death and 13 counts of dangerous driving causing bodily harm. His inexperience and negligence laid bare in forensic detail. A driver who shouldn't have been given a double trailer, who had gotten lost and stopped to check maps, who had missed every single warning sign at that intersection in ways that defied explanation. His defense lawyer painted him as a victim of circumstance, an inexperienced driver thrown into a situation beyond his capabilities, while the Crown emphasized that all he had to do was stop, just stop, and this catastrophe could have been prevented. 90 impact statements filled the court over 3 days, a chorus of anguish and anger and grief that painted the full human cost of one man's failure at one intersection on 1 April evening. And then came the moment that would define this tragedy as something more than just another bus crash, more than just another tale of senseless loss. Christina Horgan stood before Yaskirat Singh Sidhu and spoke words that seemed to come from some well of grace that shouldn't. exist in human hearts, she told him that she forgave him. Her voice was steady, even as she acknowledged the injustice and sadness and anger that still lived inside her. Even as she called his actions negligent and irresponsible. Even as she detailed how every aspect of her family's life had been shattered. She explained that her husband had been a man of faith, that she shared that faith, that she had been forgiven for things she hadn't deserved forgiveness for, and therefore she would extend the same grace to the man who had killed Darcy. She invited Sidhu to learn about the incredible people who had died in the crash, to understand the magnitude of what was lost, to carry their memories with him as he faced the consequences of his choices. Paul Jefferson, billet parent to players who died and survived, echoed Christina's words of forgiveness, his voice breaking but unwavering. Mark Dahlgren, Caleb's father, spoke of his son's resilience and faith, expressing confidence that Caleb would rise up to live big for those who couldn't. Not every family could reach this place of grace. Some called Sidhu a monster and demanded the maximum sentence, and their anger was just as valid, just as true, as truthful an expression of love for the dead as any words of forgiveness. Carol Bronze, whose daughter Dana had died in the crash, admitted she hadn't yet forgiven, but was trying to, because her daughter would have wanted that. The courtroom became a cathedral of competing truths: that justice demands punishment, that mercy offers healing, that both can exist simultaneously in hearts broken beyond repair. The judge would eventually sentence Sidhu to 8 years in prison, a compromise that satisfied no one and everyone. A legal answer to a question that transcended law. The forgiveness extended by Christina, Hogan, and others rippled outward from that courtroom like stones dropped in still water, spreading across Saskatchewan and across Canada in concentric circles of grace and mercy. News outlets reported it with something like amazement, as if they'd witnessed something miraculous in that unremarkable courtroom, something that challenged their cynical assumptions about human nature and the limits of compassion. Social media exploded with debates about forgiveness and justice, some praising the family's faith and strength, while others questioned whether forgiving such negligence dishonored the dead. But for those who extended forgiveness, it wasn't about Sidhu at all. It was about choosing to live free from the prison of hatred and vengeance, about honoring loved ones by embodying the values they'd lived, about faith that insisted on mercy even when mercy felt impossible. Vigils and memorial services transformed grief into communal ritual, giving the nation permission to mourn together. On April 8, just 2 days after the crash, more than 2,000 people gathered at the Elgar Peterson Arena in Humboldt for an interfaith service that was broadcast across Canada and watched around the world. Ministers from every denomination came together, their theological differences set aside in the face of shared sorrow, leading prayers and reading scripture and proclaiming hope that felt fragile but necessary. Sean Brandau spoke with raw honesty about his own emptiness and need, admitting he'd arrived at the crash site with nothing to give because he wasn't full of hope himself, and in that admission he gave others permission to acknowledge their own spiritual poverty. At 7:32 p.m., the exact moment when the puck should have dropped for Game 6 against the Nipawin Hawks, the arena fell silent, every head bowed, every heart breaking in unison. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau attended the vigil, sitting among the grieving families, not as a politician but as a father and Canadian citizen overwhelmed by the magnitude of this loss. Pope Francis sent condolences through the Vatican Secretary of State, commending the souls of the deceased to God's mercy and offering blessings to all touched by the tragedy. Queen Elizabeth and President Donald Trump both sent messages of support, as did hockey legends and celebrities whose names the boys had worshipped. But more meaningful than famous condolences were the thousands of ordinary gestures that accumulated into a tidal wave of solidarity. Hockey sticks appeared on porches across Canada, leaning against doorframes like wooden prayers, and millions of people wore green and yellow ribbons or Broncos jerseys on designated days of remembrance. The hashtag Humboldt Strong became more than just words on a screen. It became a covenant, a promise that this community would not be forgotten, and these boys would not have died in vain. Money poured into a GoFundMe campaign with astonishing speed and volume. More than 130,000 donors from 80 countries contributing over $15 million in just 9 days, the largest campaign in Canadian history. A tangible measure of how deeply the tragedy had pierced the world's heart. People who had never watched a hockey game, who couldn't find Saskatchewan on a map, who had no connection to the victims beyond shared humanity, felt compelled to give something, do something, participate somehow in bearing this unbearable burden. Green and yellow ribbons appeared everywhere, tied around trees in Humboldt, worn on lapels in Toronto and Vancouver, displayed in shop windows from coast to coast, even showing up in photographs from other countries where people wanted to signal their solidarity. Jersey Day turned the nation into a sea of hockey colors as millions wore their favorite team's jerseys to work and school. A visual reminder that hockey culture wasn't but just about sports, but about community and belonging and the particular way Canadians understood themselves. Logan Bullett's legacy became its own kind of miracle. His decision to be an organ donor, inspiring what became known as the Logan Bullett effect. In the days and weeks after his death on April 7, when his organs were donated across Canada, more than 100,000 Canadians registered as organ donors, the largest spike in registration in the nation's history. His parents, Bernadine and Toby, transformed their grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about their son's gift and encouraging others to have conversations with their families about donation. Green Shirt Day was established as an annual event on April 7 to honor Logan's memory and promote organ donation awareness. Another example of how this tragedy kept generating light even from the darkest places. Survivors like Caleb Dahlgren began their own journeys of testimony and healing. Caleb eventually writing his memoir, Crossroads, and sharing his story of faith and recovery with groups across North America, refusing to let his traumatic brain injury define the rest of his life. The Broncos, who could return to hockey, did so with a fierce determination to honor the dead by living fully, by playing with everything they had, by proving that the team's spirit survived the crash. The 2018-19 season saw two survivors, Braden Camrod and Derek Patter, back on the ice wearing the green and yellow, each game a small victory over death and despair. The team made the playoffs, and though they were eliminated in the second round, the season itself was a triumph, proof that Humboldt was still standing, still skating, still believing. The community rallied around the team with an intensity born of shared trauma and hope for redemption, filling the arena game after game, their cheers, both celebration and memorial. Above the ice hung 16 banners honoring those who died, visible reminders that these boys would always be part of the Broncos story, that their absence was acknowledged even as life moved forward. The ripple effects continued to spread as the tragedy prompted concrete changes to driver training requirements and intersection safety across Canada. Saskatchewan made mandatory truck driver training a law in 2019, and federal regulations followed in 2020, ensuring that other inexperienced drivers like Sidhu wouldn't be put in situations they weren't equipped to handle. The intersection itself was modified with rumble strips and improved signage. Attempts to prevent another tragedy at a crossroads that had already claimed too many lives. But more than policy changes, the Humboldt Broncos crash changed the conversation about grief and faith and forgiveness in Canadian culture, creating space for public expressions of spirituality that had become rare in an increasingly secular nation. The sight of ministers and pastors leading prayers on national television, of families speaking openly about their Christian faith as the source of their ability to forgive, reminded a watching world that ancient wisdom about mercy and grace still had power in modern life. Years later, the forgiveness question continued to reverberate through Canadian courts and hearts as Yaskarat Singh Sidhu faced deportation proceedings, his permanent residency status challenged by immigration authorities who argued that his crimes warranted removal from Canada. Some families, like Chris Joseph, whose son Jackson had died, called for deportation as the right decision, a necessary consequence that sent a message about accountability. Others, like Scott Thomas, whose son Evan had died, argued against deportation, insisting that Sidhu was already serving a life sentence of remorse in his own mind, and that adding deportation felt like double punishment. The debate revealed fault lines in how different people understood justice and mercy, punishment and redemption. But it also demonstrated the ongoing engagement with these questions years after the crash. People still cared enough to argue about what should happen to the man who caused it. Caleb Dahlgren's recovery defied medical expectations. His determination to return to hockey, driving him through months of rehabilitation that tested his faith and resolve in equal measure. He joined the York University Lions varsity hockey team, then graduated and began studying at the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College, building a future that honored his past while refusing to be defined by it. His book Crossroads became a testament to resilience and the power of positive attitude, each page bearing witness to the way suffering can either destroy or transform, depending on how we choose to meet it. He spoke openly about his faith, about the way belief in something larger than himself had carried him through the darkest days, about the debt he felt to the 16 who didn't survive to tell their own stories. His father Mark's words at the sentencing hearing came back to him often, the confidence that Caleb would rise up to living big for those who lost their lead. He accepted that burden as both responsibility and gift. The forgiveness extended by the families became a living sermon, a demonstration of faith more powerful than any theological argument, a practical application of principles that often remain abstract and theoretical. People who didn't share the family's Christian faith found themselves moved and challenged by it, forced to reconsider their assumptions about justice and human nature. Those who did share that faith saw it lived out with a purity and courage that called them to examine their own willingness to forgive smaller offenses and lesser hurts. Christina Hogan continued to live in the shadow of her husband's legacy and her own choice to forgive, speaking occasionally about her journey while respecting other families' right to their own paths through grief. She sent messages to Sidhu on the anniversary of the crash, small acknowledgements that his life had also changed that day, that he too bore scars that would never fully heal. The ultimate miracle of the Humboldt Broncos tragedy wasn't that 16 people died. There was nothing miraculous about that senseless loss, nothing redemptive about death that stole futures and broke families. The miracle was what came after, in the spaces between grief and rage where grace somehow took root and grew. The miracle was forgiveness offered when unforgiveness would have been justified, mercy extended when justice demanded punishment, hope maintained when despair seemed more honest. The miracle was watching a community that should have been destroyed by this loss instead become stronger, more connected, more willing to bear each other's burdens and hold each other's pain. The miracle was seeing faith lived out not in triumphalist declarations that God had some plan for this tragedy, but in humble admissions that we don't know why bad things happen to good people. We only know who holds us through the suffering. The story of the Humboldt Broncos endures because it speaks to something deeper than hockey, or hockey culture, something more universal than Canadian identity or prairie resilience. It endures because it asks the question that every person eventually faces in the midst of their own private tragedies. What do we do with our grief? Do we let it harden into bitterness and rage, calcifying around our hearts until we become monuments to our own suffering? Or do we somehow, impossibly, allow it to soften us, to open us, to make us more rather than less human? The families who chose forgiveness didn't do so because they felt less pain than those who couldn't forgive. They felt the same agony, the same sense of injustice, the same fury at the randomness of it all. They chose forgiveness because they believed it was the path toward healing, toward life, toward honoring the dead by refusing to let death have the final word. In Humboldt, the Elgar Peterson Arena still stands, and the Broncos still play. And every season brings new young men who don the green and yellow and carry forward a legacy they didn't earn but have inherited. The 16 banners hanging from the rafters remind everyone who enters that some absences can never be filled, that some losses leave permanent marks, that memory is both burden and blessing. The community has learned to hold both grief and joy simultaneously, to celebrate victories while acknowledging the players who should be celebrating alongside them, to move forward without forgetting those who can't come with them. The makeshift memorial at the crash site, with its white crosses and hockey sticks and faded jerseys and giant green cross emblazoned with #Humboldt strong, has weathered wind and snow and rain and sun, its colors bleached but its meaning undiminished. Asterisk. The Humboldt Broncos tragedy teaches us that faith isn't about having all the answers or understanding God's plan or seeing silver linings in unspeakable suffering. Faith is about choosing to believe that love is stronger than death, that mercy is more powerful than vengeance, that grace can grow even in ground salted with tears. It teaches us that forgiveness isn't a single decision made once and then completed, but an ongoing practice, a daily choice to release the grip of hatred and resentment, even when they would be righteous responses to real injustice. It teaches us that communities survive tragedies not by pretending they didn't happen or by moving on too quickly, but by holding space for grief while also making room for hope, by honoring the dead through how the living choose to live. What happened at that intersection on April 6, 2018, will never make sense. There is no explanation that can transform senseless tragedy into meaningful narrative. No theology that can make 16 deaths anything other than 16 tragedies multiplied into countless ripples of pain. But what happened after the crash, in the days and months and years that followed, reveals something about the human spirit that transcends explanation. It reveals our capacity to choose love over hate, forgiveness over vengeance, hope over despair. Even when choosing those things feels impossible, it reveals that faith isn't primarily about belief in doctrines or adherence to rules, but about how we treat each other when everything is broken and there are no easy answers. It reveals that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The boys who died that evening: Adam Herold, Connor Lucan, Evan Thomas, Jacob Leicht, Jackson Joseph, Logan Boulette, Logan Hunter, Stephen Wack, Parker Tobin, Xavier LaBelle, Dana Bronze, Brody Hines, Tyler Bieber, Mark Cross, Darcy Hogan, and Glenn Dorkson are gone but not forgotten. Their names spoken in prayers and written on memorials and carried in hearts that will never fully heal. They remain young forever, preserved in photographs and memories at the exact age when life seemed limitless and dreams felt achievable and tomorrow was always guaranteed. Their families continue the work of living, some days easier than others, carrying the weight of absence that no amount of time or forgiveness can fully lift. And in that ongoing work of living with loss, they bear witness to a truth older than hockey and deeper than grief. That love persists beyond death. That community sustains us through unimaginable sorrow, and that even in the valley of the shadow, we need not walk alone. This account is based on extensive reporting by CBC News, Global News, CTV News, the Canadian Press, Sports Spectrum, the Christian Science Monitor, the Catholic Register, and other credible outlets documenting the April 6, 2018 Humboldt Broncos bus crash in Saskatchewan, Canada. Christina Hogan's victim impact statement and her public testimony of forgiveness, Sean Brandau's vigil address, Caleb Dahlgren's memoir, Crossroads, and the nationwide response of solidarity through #HumboldtStrong have been verified through multiple independent sources. While this tragedy occurred in Canada, rather than the United States, as specified in the Faithwriter Guidelines, the story's themes of faith, forgiveness, and redemption transcend national borders.